Richard Carlile, the 8th of December, 1790, the 10th of February, 1843. Hello, it's r.w.forder again. Richard Carlile was born in Ashburton, Devon, the son of a shoemaker. He received an elementary schooling and was apprenticed as a tinsmith in Plymouth. By 1813, he was living in Gosport, Hampshire, where he married Jane Cousins. Soon afterwards, he moved to London to work as a tinsmith. But 1816 was a year of economic depression, and he found himself with little employment. He began attending political meetings and read Thomas Paine, who he had been taught to burn in effigy as a child. To make a living, he began to sell the writings of reformers, particularly Paine, and weekly newspapers such as the band Black Dwarf. Then he started publishing and selling his own journal. All dangerous stuff at a time of repression, fear of France and fear of revolution. In particular, Carlile published all Paine's works, who became his hero, and he kept his ideas, kept Paine's ideas alive. Carlile made something of a name for himself as a radical and a reformer. And on the 16th of August, 1819, the events now known as Peterloo occurred in Manchester. Carlile had been invited, he attended, and he was on the hustings when the yeomanry intervened. In the aftermath, he managed to avoid arrest. He returned to London and wrote his eyewitness account of what had occurred. Soon afterwards, he published his famous print depicting events, which he dedicated, or the print he dedicated, to Henry Hunt, the main speaker at the meeting, and the female reformers in Manchester. When in Manchester, Carlile was greatly impressed by the role of women at Peterloo. They had turned out in their thousands, many dressed in white. Carlile was horrified that amongst the casualties, there was a disproportionate number of women. In his print, Carlile, shown on the extreme left of the platform, is shown symbolically next to Mary Fildays, chairman of the Manchester Female Reform Society. Also, if you look closely, you can see a woman being sabred. Note also the banner carrying the legend, universal suffrage, not universal manhood suffrage. Carlyle's activities were all too much for the authorities, so he was prosecuted for blasphemy, blasphemous libel and sedition. He was found guilty of what he called his mock trial, and he was sentenced to 3 years in Dorchester jail with a fine of £1,500, a fortune by the standards of the time. In fact, he served 7 years because he refused to pay the fine. As a result, his premises were raided and his stock was confiscated. On the other hand, his cell was light and airy, and remarkably, he continued to edit his journal, The Republican, from jail, which was now published by his wife, Jane, back on Fleet Street. The Republican sold well, and Carlile produced 12 volumes while in prison. Carlyle's religious beliefs evolved at this time, and he decided he was an atheist rather than a deist like his hero, Thomas Paine. In 1820, Jane was in turn tried for seditious libel, and she was sentenced to 2 years. She spent this time with her husband and their infant son, who they named Thomas Paine Carlile. While in prison, Jane gave birth to a daughter, Hypatia. Jane's place on Fleet Street had been taken by Richard's sister Mary, who in turn received 6 months' sentence. She in turn, Dorchester, she shared the same cell as Richard and Jane. 8 of Carlyle's shop workers were also prosecuted, and more than 150 men and women were sent to Newgate Jail in London for selling the Republican. Despite all, Fleet Street book sales continued. To make the authorities' task more difficult, books were sold from behind a screen. On the customer's side was a clock face bearing the names of the books, with a hand that could be pointed at the relevant title, whereupon a hidden shopman pushed the book through a hole in the screen, thus avoiding identification. Carlile called this selling books by clockwork. By 1825, it was beginning to dawn on the authorities that their actions were merely creating a bigger demand for Carlyle's publications. Suddenly and unexpectedly, he was unconditionally released. His first action was to take on the lease of a larger shop at 62 Fleet Street and expand his publishing business. This shop was externally, provocatively decorated, and this caused various ruptions and rioting outside. The shop's still there today, and that's what it looks like now. If Carlyle's status as a controversialist was in any doubt, he resolved that in 1826 by publishing his own Every Woman's Book, the first book in English to advocate birth control, provide contraceptive advice, and, wait for it, he advocated free love. Here is a frontispiece from an early edition. Carlile was saying to horrified Christians, don't accuse me of indecency when there are stories like this in the Bible. Of course, the thing that's missing in this illustration is the fig leaf. For Carlile, contraception served 2 purposes. Not only did it prevent conception, but it also liberated sexual pleasure. I quote, "See what an evil arises from bastard children, from deserted children, from half-starved and diseased children, and even where the parents are most industrious and most virtuous, from a half-starved, naked and badly housed family, from families crowded into one room." Carlile was appalled by the practice of abortion and infanticide, which were common at the time in British towns and cities. Shockingly, Carlile also claimed Christian sexual morality was a constraint on female emancipation, reducing women to subservience. he accused Christian marriage of placing women under a form of legalized slavery. Carlile saw lovemaking as a healthy pursuit, both physically and mentally, and challenged still more taboos by claiming women found it as pleasurable and satisfying as men. He even went so far as to advocate the establishment of temples of Venus, where the young could receive instruction in sexual technique from the experienced. Carlile must have been disappointed by the reaction of some to his book, although perhaps he shouldn't have been surprised. Many female followers turned against him, including Mary Faldays. She objected to Carlyle's implied contention that the ills of society were due to the behaviour of the working class rather than the greed of the rich. William Cobbett branded Carlile the grand pornographer and pimp who planned to lure into prostitution the maidenhood of England. Despite all, Every Woman's Book went through many editions and evolved with Carlyle's own thoughts. After his release, Carlile did not restrict himself to publishing and writing, but went on a number of provincial lecture tours between the years 1825 and 1829. There were 4 expeditions altogether, 2 in 1827, lasted 8 months in total, 1 in 1828, 6 months, and another in 1829, another 6 months. Remember, there were no railways then. He had to travel by turnpike road. Although these tours had mixed successes, they did establish a national network of reformers. He was always well received in Portsmouth and Manchester in particular, although he had substantial support in many other industrial towns in the North and Midlands. Carlile was not a particularly good or forceful speaker. In 1829, he teamed up with the Devil's Chaplain, the self-styled Reverend Robert Taylor, and they launched their infidel mission. Taylor was a Cambridge-educated former Anglican minister who served a prison sentence for blasphemy. His oratorical skills greatly exceeded Carlyle's, hence their joint enterprise was a considerable success. Sadly, the duration of Carlyle's tours may help explain his falling out of love with Jane, despite her extraordinary devotion, loyalty, and sacrifices. It seems he first met Elisa Sharples in 1827 when he visited Bolton. In 1831, Elisa moved to London and went on to supplant Jane as Carlyle's moral wife. Elisa emerged as a formidable character and campaigner in her own right. She was a good platform speaker who edited her own feminist journal, Isis. In 1830, Carlile opened the Blackfriars Rotunda, just down the road from Fleet Street. This was a substantial building with 2 lecture theatres, one of which could accommodate up to 1,500. The Rotunda became a centre of reformers and radicals' activities in London at a time of mounting discontent. In 1831, Carlile was incarcerated again, this time in London, for an article defending agricultural workers and the rural sabotage movement known as the Swing Riots after the mythical leader, Captain Swing. After his release, Carlile lived on another 10 years, but his moment had passed. So, what were his achievements? What is his legacy? First and foremost, perhaps, he republished all the mighty Paine's works and helped keep his ideas alive. Second, he was a champion of press freedom, freedom of speech. This has always been and remains a central secularist concern. Third, he was a feminist before the term had ever been heard of. He was a feminist and champion of the rights of women. From this time on, female emancipation has been a secularist theme. It's about equal rights for all. Fourth, he was a pioneer birth controller, and again we can identify a consistent and continuing secularist theme. The right of all, particularly women, to control their fertility. Fifth, he was perhaps the first to champion the idea of a national radical secularist movement. Thus, he paved the way for the foundation of the National Secular Society some 40 years later. There is only one relatively modern biography of Carlile, which was written by an American, Joel Viner, in 1983, and entitled Radicalism and Free Thought in 19th Century Britain. This is very difficult to find. However, Michael Bush's The Friends and Following of Richard Carlile, published in 2016, is more easily obtained, and there are copies available on ABE or ABE books, as are copies of another book by Bush entitled What is Love, which deals primarily with Carlyle's work as a birth controller. Again, thank you for listening. If you want to contact me about this or any other aspect of secularist and NSS history, my email address is r.w.forder@btinternet.com.